On the morning of March 13, 1932, Baron Robert Lejeune woke to the smell of smoke. The central heating system he had just installed in his family's beloved chateau, a modernization intended to make the ancient stone walls more comfortable, had malfunctioned in the night. By the time firefighters arrived from town across the Vienne department, flames had already consumed the library that contained centuries of rare manuscripts. The Gobelins tapestries that had adorned the great halls for generations were turning to ash. Antique furniture, priceless paintings, the accumulated treasures of noble families stretching back to the Crusades, all of it fed the inferno that roared through the neo-Gothic towers. Firefighters worked desperately, but they could not prevent the disaster. When the flames finally died, the roof was gone. The interior was gutted. Only the stone shell remained, open to the sky like a broken crown. Baron Robert Lejeune surveyed the ruins of his family's estate and faced an impossible choice. The damage was estimated at several million francs. The Great Depression had devastated global markets. There would be no money to rebuild. The Baron walked away. He would die 11 years later, in 1943, never having restored what his family had spent 4 generations perfecting. For 85 years, the chateau stood abandoned. Rain fell through empty window frames. Trees grew up through the courtyard, their branches threading through Gothic arches, as if nature itself was attempting to hold the crumbling stones together. Ivy consumed the turrets. Moss carpeted the grand staircase. The fairy tale castle became a fairy tale ruin, frozen in a state of romantic decay that captured the imagination of photographers and urban explorers who glimpsed its haunting beauty rising from the moat like something from a dream. Then, in 2017, something unprecedented happened. A crowdfunding campaign launched by 2 French entrepreneurs offered people a chance to own a piece of the castle for just €50. Within 2 months, nearly 28,000 people from 115 countries had contributed over €1.6 million. The Château de la Mothe-Chandeniers became the world's first castle purchased through collective ownership, not by a government, not by a billionaire, but by ordinary people who believed that some things are too beautiful to let die. This is the story of that castle. The medieval lords who built it, the Renaissance nobles who transformed it, the 19th century barons who made it magnificent, the fire that destroyed it, the decades of abandonment that should have been its end, and the revolutionary act of collective will that is bringing it back to life, stone by stone, dream by dream. The castle's origins reach back to the early 13th century, when a powerful feudal family named Bouquet constructed a fortress on a strategic outcrop in the Laudunais region of what is now west-central France. They called it La Motte de Bouquet, the Motte of Bouquet, a name derived from the motte and bailey design common to medieval strongholds of the era. The motte itself was an artificial earthen mound, elevated above the surrounding marshland, providing both a commanding view of approaching enemies and a natural defensive advantage. The Bouquet family was not a minor provincial clan. They held one of the 4 great baronies of Laudunais and maintained their domain for 3 to 4 centuries. Their coat of arms, gules and anchored cross reflected their status as vassals directly dependent on the King of France. Several family members held considerable rank at court and served in the armies of Anjou. The most distinguished among them was Hugues V de Bouquet, known as Hugues le Grand, a knight who accompanied King Louis IX, known as Saint Louis, on the 7th Crusade in 1248. At the bloody Battle of Mansoura in Egypt, Hugues performed acts of valor that earned him lasting renown. Upon returning to France, he founded a Franciscan convent in the nearby town of Loudun, securing his family's spiritual legacy alongside their military reputation. The original castle, embodied the pragmatic brutality of medieval defensive architecture. At its heart rose the keep, the donjon, positioned atop the motte, where it could serve as a final refuge during siege. Surrounding the elevated structure were curtain walls that defined the inner bailey's perimeter. In the earliest years, wooden palisades provided rapid defense, and these would later be replaced by stone, as the castle grew in permanence and importance. The entire complex was encircled by a water-filled moat, fed by diverting the nearby Bois River, creating what was effectively an island fortress, accessible only by a single bridge. The location was chosen not by accident, but by military necessity. The Laudonnais region sat at the intersection of three historical provinces, Poitou, Anjou, and Touraine, making it a perpetual borderland contested by rival powers. The castle commanded the approaches to this strategically vital territory, enabling the Bocquet lords to control passage through their domain. Contemporary accounts noted that few castles in the region were as well fortified as La Motte de Bocquet. This strategic importance would prove both blessing and curse during the 100 Years' War, when English and French forces fought for control of France from 1337 to 1453. Historical records indicate that the castle was taken by English forces on at least 2 occasions during this prolonged conflict. Each time, French forces eventually recovered it as part of broader reconquest campaigns, but the repeated sieges left the structure battered. By the close of the 14th century, under restored French control, the wooden palisades had been progressively replaced with stone fortifications, better suited to evolving warfare tactics and the increasing use of gunpowder. The Bocquet dynasty's direct control of the castle ended in 1404, when Marie de Bocquet, the last of her line, married Guillaume II de Château, Seigneur of Mothe-Chandeniers. Through this marriage, the castle passed to the Château family and acquired a new name, La Mothe-Chandeniers, linking the ancient fortress to the Château lands in neighboring Deux-Sèvres. The transformation of a name marked the beginning of a transformation in character. The grim military stronghold of the Bocquets would gradually evolve into something more refined, as successive noble families sought not merely to defend their territory, but to display their wealth and sophistication. An inventory from 1530, conducted by regional historian Léo de Saivre, preserved in the Bulletins de la Société des Antiquaires de l'Ouest, and later published in 1904, provides a remarkable window into the castle's medieval architecture, just before its Renaissance transformation. Despite being described as in advanced disrepair, the castle retained 6 distinct towers: an old destroyed tower that may have been the original donjon, a round tower or high tower, a half-timbered tower known as La Tour à Pans, a vaulted tower called La Tour Voûtée, a newer tower, and an additional unnamed tower. These foundations would prove more permanent than the families who built upon them, persisting through centuries of reconstruction to anchor the castle's successive incarnations. Chapter 2: The Rochechouart and the Rise of Renaissance Splendor. The castle's destiny shifted dramatically in the 1448, when Anne de Chauny, daughter of Marie de Bocquet, and Guillaume II de Chauny, married Jean de Rochechouart. This union brought the castle into possession of what historians recognize as the oldest noble family in France, whose origins trace back to Fouché of Limoges, who became Viscount of Limoges in the year 876. The Rochechouarts served as counselors and chamberlains to Kings Charles VI, Charles VII, and Louis XI. They commanded troops as chevaliers bannerets and remained stalwart supporters of the French crown throughout the struggles against English domination. Jean de Rochechouart served as chamberlain to King Louis XI, a position of intimate trust at court. Through his marriage to Anne de Chauny, he acquired not just the castle, but 2 additional domains, Javarzai and Chamdeniers. He passed these holdings to his eldest son, François de Rochechouart, who adopted the compound surname Rochechouart-Chandeniers to reflect his inheritance. From the 15th century forward, the castle would be known by the name it bears today, La Mothe-Chandeniers. François de Rochechouart, born around 1450, embodied the courtier knight ideal of the Renaissance. He served as chamberlain to both Charles VIII and the Duke of Orléans, who would become King Louis XII, and he rose to the prestigious positions of Sénéchal de Toulouse and Grand Maître des Eaux et Forêts du Languedoc. His marriage to Blanche d'Aumont on November 2nd, 1478, produced 12 children, many of whom were born at Javarzay or La Mothe de Beausset. One of these children, Christophe de Rochechouart, was born within the castle on December 17, 1486, and he would himself become Seigneur de Chandeniers before his death in 1549. Under Rochechouart ownership, the castle underwent its first major architectural transformation. The stern medieval fortress began yielding to Renaissance elegance. Mullioned windows, called fenêtres à meneaux, replaced narrow defensive slits, flooding interior chambers with light. Elegant turrets or tourelles sprouted from corners and roof lines, their delicate stonework emphasizing beauty over brutality. A grand stone staircase was constructed, providing ceremonial access between floors. Ornate doorways framed by classical proportions announced the family's cultural sophistication to arriving guests. The most significant Renaissance additions appeared on the east facade, sometimes called the Venetian side for its refined detailing. A round donjon and a hexagonal tower were constructed around 1530, featuring balanced geometries and decorative stonework that spoke of Italian influence filtering through the French court. The west facade received two gabled wings flanking a central clock tower, with an arcaded gallery creating a harmonious composition typical of the great Loire Valley Château that were transforming France's architectural landscape during this period. Water remained central to the castle's identity, but its purpose shifted from purely defensive to decorative. The Rochechouarts expanded the canal system, diverting more water from the Bois River to create an elaborate moat that transformed the fortress into an island palace. The surrounding waterways, once designed to deter invaders, now served as mirrors, reflecting the castle's growing magnificence. This integration of architecture and water would become one of the chateau's defining characteristics, later inspiring comparisons to the floating elegance of Château d'Azay, Le Rideau. The most dramatic transformation came in the mid-17th century under François II de Rochechouart, Chandeniers, Marquis de Chandeniers. His path to the castle was paved with political danger. On November 11th, 1630, during the infamous Day of the Dupes, François opposed the powerful Cardinal Richelieu and narrowly escaped execution, receiving royal clemency at the last possible moment. He was imprisoned and then exiled to Italy, where he encountered Cardinal Mazarin, a fateful connection that would draw him into the next great political upheaval. When the Fronde erupted between 1648 and 1653, a series of civil wars pitting French nobles against the growing power of the crown and Cardinal Mazarin, François threw his lot with the rebels. The Fronde's failure left him exiled from the royal court around 1650, a fallen noble with no place at Versailles. In 1654, he retreated to La Mothe-Chandeniers, which had fallen into considerable disrepair during the turbulent years. What followed was a transformation born of wounded pride and boundless ambition. Determined to create a court of his own in exile, François poured his resources into converting the dilapidated castle into an opulent residence surrounded by magnificent parks and gardens. He attracted illustrious figures to his rural refuge, creating a glittering salon in the countryside. The Jesuit priest Leonard Frison was so impressed by the results that in 1657 he composed a Latin verse poem titled Mothe-Chandeniers, describing a castle surrounded by running waters with a large bridge spanning the moats, whose entrance is guarded by two enormous bronze lions. But Francois' extravagance exceeded his means. The lavish lifestyle that had made La Mothe-Chandeniers the wonder of the province also brought financial catastrophe. By 1668, the Marquis faced personal bankruptcy. The domain was sold to creditors, passing to Guillaume Urbain de Lamoignon, Comte de Courson. In 1685, the Rochechouart-Chandeniers family relinquished their final claims to the castle they had held for over 2 centuries. The bronze lions at the gate had guarded a family's downfall. The century following the Rochechouart bankruptcy saw the castle slip into obscurity. The Lamoignon family maintained ownership, but La Mothe-Chandeniers had lost its role as a showpiece residence. When Anne-Victoire de Lamoignon married René Charles de Maupeou, who would rise to become vice-chancellor and keeper of the seals of France, the castle passed into her possession in 1766. Yet despite the family's political prominence, the estate was hardly inhabited. The buildings deteriorated without the attention of resident owners or the resources that sustained great households. The French Revolution of 1789 swept away the old order that had created such chateaux. Throughout France, noble estates were seized, culled, or destroyed by revolutionary forces. The fate of La Mothe-Chandeniers during these tumultuous years remains somewhat obscure in the historical record, but the castle emerged from the revolutionary period, damaged and uninhabited, another casualty of the upheaval that had transformed French society. Salvation arrived in 1809 in the person of François Fidèle Hennequart, a wealthy Parisian businessman and financier who purchased the devastated property from the Maupeou family. Hennequart was not interested in the castle as a relic of aristocratic pretension. He was a practical man of the new bourgeois age, and he set about restoring the castle while preserving elements of the medieval edifice that remained structurally sound. Hennequart's vision extended beyond the castle walls. He commissioned the digging of additional canals on each side of the building, including a grand canal at the rear designed for pleasure navigation, a gentleman's waterway for leisurely boat excursions through the estate. He planted a vineyard in the park and traced new pathways through the grounds, transforming the neglected property into a functioning agricultural enterprise with touches of romantic charm. When Hennequart died in 1845, at the age of 82, the estate passed to his third daughter, Amy Alexandrine Hennequart. She acquired it with the assistance of her husband, Jacques Ardoin. The inheritance included not just the castle, but 12 farms, 2 mills, and 5 houses, a substantial provincial domain. Jacques Ardoin was a Bonapartist and Conservative Party member who had founded a bank in 1814, specializing in investments and loans to Germany, Poland, and Russia. He brought financial sophistication to the management of the estate and ambition for its architectural future. In July 1847, the Ardoin launched a major reconstruction that would transform La Mothe-Chandeniers into the romantic vision that captivates observers today. The project would take 14 years to complete, plagued by the practical challenges of the site, including its remoteness, the limited construction space on the island, and the difficulty of transporting materials, workers, and equipment across the relatively narrow bridge that provided the only access. When the reconstruction was completed in 1861, the castle had been reimagined in the neo-Gothic style, then sweeping through European architecture. The designer, identified in some records as an architect named Gaumont, drew inspiration from multiple sources. The romantic idealism of Ludwig II of Bavaria, whose fantastical castles were redefining what nobility could mean in the industrial age, and the Renaissance chateau of the Loire Valley, particularly the water-surrounded elegance of Azay-le-Rideau and the famous spiral staircase of Blois. Gothic windows, elegant balconies, pointed roofs, and lush gardens surrounded the transformed edifice. The stern medieval fortress had become an architectural folly, a fairy tale castle made real. The reconstruction altered everything. The completed chateau served primarily as a hunting season residence rather than a year-round home. Alexandrine Ardoin never made it her primary dwelling, preferring Paris for most of the year. But in late 1870, as the Franco-Prussian War brought siege to Paris, she chose not to return to the capital. She died at the chateau on November 20th, 1870, as the war that would reshape European politics raged beyond its walls. The castle's most glamorous era began when Marie Ardoin, daughter of Jacques and Alexandrine, married Baron Joseph Désiré Edgard Lejeune in 1857 or 1858. Baron Edgard was the son of Louis-François Baron Lejeune, a celebrated French painter and Napoleonic general who had died in 1848. More importantly, the younger Lejeune served as equerry to Emperor Napoleon III, following the establishment of the Second Emperor in 1851. This position connected the castle to the imperial court and ushered in an era of social brilliance. The glamorous era had arrived. Together, Baron Edgard and Marie transformed La Mothe-Chandeniers into a high society gathering place. Lavish parties drew the elite of Second Empire France to the remote chateau, where guests arrived across the bridge spanning the moat to find themselves in a romantic wonderland of Gothic turrets, gaslit galleries, and gardens perfumed with roses vases. The sound of music and laughter echoed across the water as Baron Edgard played host to the mundane society he had cultivated at court. This golden age was brief. Baron Edgard died on April 1, 1867, leaving his widow Marie to manage the estate alone. She made the chateau her primary residence, a marked change from its previous role as a seasonal retreat. Following her mother Alexandrine's death in 1870 and subsequent inheritance disputes, the domain and Château were valued at 1,350,000 francs, with furniture assessed at an additional 46,310 francs. Marie bought out her sister Augustine Adeline's share to become sole owner, securing the castle for her branch of the family. She became the sole owner. In 1889, Marie Lejeune bequeathed the chateau to her son Robert, who undertook various works to maintain and improve the property. The castle remained a functioning aristocratic residence, staffed by servants who maintained the gardens, stoked the fireplaces, and kept the dream alive. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, La Mothe-Chandeniers stood as a monument to the persistence of beauty in an industrializing world, a fairy tale castle that had survived revolution, war, and bankruptcy to emerge more magnificent than ever. Then came the fire. Chapter 4. 13 Minutes That Destroyed 4 Centuries. The morning of Sunday, March 13th, 1932, began like countless mornings before at La Mothe-Chandeniers. Baron Robert Lejeune, now elderly, had recently invested in a modern convenience that promised to transform life in the ancient stone chateau: central heating. No longer would servants need to maintain fires in every occupied room, and no longer would the family shiver through drafty corridors in winter. The new heating system represented progress and comfort. The 20th century brought to a medieval fortress. No one knows exactly what malfunctioned, whether a faulty installation, an electrical fault, or a structural weakness in the chimney system. What is certain is that sometime in the early hours of that Sunday morning, fire broke out. By the time the alarm was raised, flames were already spreading through the building's interior. Firefighters were summoned from towns across the region, racing through the Vienne countryside toward the column of smoke rising above the trees. When they arrived, they faced an impossible task. The chateau sat on an island, accessible only by the bridge. Equipment had to be brought across piece by piece. Water, ironically, surrounded the building on all sides, but the pumping technology of the era struggled to direct it effectively onto the upper floors where the fire raged most intensely. The firefighters worked with desperate courage, but they could not prevent the catastrophe. The fire tore through room after room, consuming everything in its path. The library, containing centuries of rare books and manuscripts accumulated by generations of noble families, was reduced to ash. The Gobelins tapestries, noted by Le Figaro in its March 14, 1932 edition, as being of great value, burned beyond salvation. Antique furniture crafted by master artisans, valuable paintings that had adorned the walls for decades, rare objects, and historical artifacts that could never be replaced, all of it fed the flames. The newspaper L'Ouest Éclair reported on March 15, 1932, that valuable tapestries, rare objects, precious paintings, and an important library were, along with the Renaissance-style buildings, consumed by the flames. The damage was estimated at several million francs. The fire had not merely damaged the Château, it had gutted it completely, leaving only the exterior stone walls standing. What survived told its own story. The chapel, separated from the main building, emerged intact, its stained glass windows unbroken, its sacred space preserved as if protected by divine intervention. The Dovecote Tower stood untouched. Several outbuildings, positioned at sufficient distance from the inferno, escaped destruction. But the heart of the chateau, the great halls where nobles had feasted, the chambers where generations had been born and died, the library where scholars had studied and dreamers had wandered, all of it was gone. Most critically, the roof was destroyed. In architectural terms, this was a death sentence. A building can survive fire damage to interiors. Walls can be rebuilt, furniture replaced, decoration restored. But a building without a roof is a building condemned. Rain falls directly onto floors and down through walls. In winter, water freezes in cracks, expanding and shattering stone. In summer, vegetation takes root in accumulated soil. Without a roof, deterioration becomes inevitable, accelerating with each passing season. Baron Robert Lejeune faced a decision that would determine the chateau's fate for nearly a century. The costs of restoration were astronomical. The fire had occurred during the depths of the Great Depression, when credit was scarce and investments had collapsed worldwide. Insurance, if any existed, could not have approached the true cost of rebuilding. Moreover, much of what had been lost, the rare books, the historic tapestries, the paintings and artifacts, could never be replaced at any price. Even a complete reconstruction would produce only a shell of what had been, a replica haunted by the ghosts of irreplaceable treasures. The Baron made his choice. He walked away. For the next 11 years, until his death in 1943, Baron Robert never rebuilt. The chateau remained a ruin, its empty windows staring out across the moat like the eye sockets of a skull. His daughter, Mademoiselle Elisabeth Lejeune, continued to live on the property, but not in the chateau itself. She made her home in the Orangery apartment, a dependency that had survived the flames. The main building, the fairy tale castle that had hosted emperors' equerries and high society soirees, stood abandoned. With the Baron's death, the last living connection to the chateau's golden age was severed. Elizabeth maintained the property, but she was a single woman without the resources, or perhaps the will, to undertake the massive restoration her family's heritage demanded. Year after year, decade after decade, the ruins deteriorated. The stone walls weathered. The wooden structural elements that had survived the fire slowly rotted. Floors collapsed between levels as support beams gave way. The grand staircase crumbled step by step. World War II brought German occupation to France, and heritage restoration could not have been further from national priorities. In the post-war years, the country focused on rebuilding bombed cities and shattered infrastructure. Ancient castles that had no military or industrial value were left to their fate. Mothe-Chandeniers, unlisted and unclassified by French heritage authorities, attracted no government attention or funding. It was simply a private ruin on private land, the responsibility of owners who lacked the means to save it. Chapter 5. 85 Years of Silence. The decades that followed the Baron's death transformed Mothe-Chandeniers from a damaged building into something else entirely. A living ruin where nature and architecture merged into a haunting hybrid that seemed to belong to neither the human world nor the natural one. The process began with water. Without a roof, every rainfall deposited moisture directly onto the interior floors. Water pooled in corners, seeped into cracks, and penetrated the mortar between stones. In winter, this water froze, expanding with irresistible force, widening fissures and loosening blocks. In spring, the thaw released new torrents that carried away loosened material. Season by season, the building wept itself apart. Then came the plants. Seeds carried by wind or birds found purchase in accumulated debris. Moss colonized the damp stone surfaces, spreading soft green carpets across walls that had once displayed tapestries. Ivy crept up the exterior, its tendrils infiltrating every crack and crevice, simultaneously destroying the mortar it invaded and binding together the stones it enveloped. Small plants grew into shrubs. Shrubs grew into trees. The most famous tree at Mothe-Chandeniers took root in the central courtyard, growing up through the building's heart, as if nature itself was attempting to hold the crumbling structure together. Its branches threaded through Gothic arches and empty window frames, reaching toward light that now flooded unobstructed through the missing roof. Other trees grew along walls and in corners, their roots descending through floors to anchor in the foundations below. Landscape architect Arnauld Delacroix, who would later work on the restoration, observed a paradox that defined the ruin's condition. The vegetation that appears to be destroying the Château is actually now helping to hold it together. The tree roots had become binders of the soils, fusing harmoniously with the foundations. The branches, threading delicately through windows without damaging the frames, provided structural bracing that prevented further collapse. To remove the trees would risk condemning the entire structure. The ruin had reached a strange equilibrium, a symbiosis between stone and wood, architecture and forest. In 1963, Robert Lejeune finally sold the estate. The purchaser was Jules Cavrois, a retired industrialist and Olympic pigeon shooting champion who had been repatriated from Algeria following France's withdrawal from its former colony. Cavrois acquired a vast domain, approximately 800 hectares of cultivable land and 1,200 hectares of forest, totaling some 2,000 hectares, or nearly 5,000 acres. But Cavrois had no interest in restoring the chateau. His intention was agricultural. He established a pilot farming operation on the 550 hectares immediately surrounding the ruins, employing workers who had also been repatriated from Algeria. The chateau itself remained untouched, continuing its slow transformation into a forest monument. By the early 1980s, Cavrois was approximately 90 years old, and his children showed no interest in the vast estate. Unable to find a single buyer willing to take on the entire property, he sold to the Groupement Agricole de Roif, an entity owned by the bank Credit Lyonnais. What followed was a tragedy of institutional indifference. The bank left the domain and woods without maintenance. It was during this period that invasive vegetation most aggressively invaded and damaged the ruins, accelerating deterioration that had already consumed 50 years. More destructively, the bank fragmented and sold the property in parcels, splitting the forest into lots for easier sale and separating the chateau from the lands that had once sustained it. The unified estate that had supported noble families for centuries was dismembered into a patchwork of disconnected properties. In 1981, Marc Damer purchased the chateau itself. Damer was a secondary school mathematics teacher, a man of modest means with an immodest dream to restore La Mothe-Chandeniers to its former glory. For 2 years he threw himself into the work, clearing debris, attempting to stabilize structures, fighting back the vegetation that threatened to consume what remained. It proved impossible. In 2013, Damer described his experience with a bitter resignation. He said, "I bought the castle 32 years ago. I worked myself nearly to death for 2 years trying to save it. But I became sickened by the obstruction from certain people. As far as I am concerned, it can be declared a ruin, so it can be demolished." The specifics of who torpedoed his efforts remain unclear, but the obstacles were overwhelming. He faced limited personal finances, no government support due to the castle's lack of heritage classification, decades of deterioration that had made restoration exponentially more expensive, and the sheer scale of work required. Damer abandoned his efforts and retreated into frustrated ownership, and the chateau continued to decay. Throughout these decades, the ruin developed a reputation that would eventually save it. Photographers discovered La Mothe-Chandeniers and began documenting its haunting beauty. Images of ivy-clad turrets reflected in the moat, of tree branches framing Gothic windows, of moss-covered stones emerging from forest gloom, spread through publications dedicated to abandoned places. The chateau became famous, not despite its decay, but because of it. A romantic ruin, straight from a fairy tale. The perfect embodiment of beauty in dissolution. Urban explorers began making pilgrimages to the site, climbing fences and crossing barriers to experience the ruins firsthand. In 2015, French courts condemned the owner to a 5-year prohibition on staying at the chateau, following an incident involving a trespassing photographer. The tension between the property's private ownership and its public fascination created a limbo that served no one. Not the owner who could not monetize or properly secure the site, and not the public who could only admire from afar what they were forbidden to enter. Then, in 2016, a drone video changed everything. Aerial footage of the chateau went viral on the internet, exposing the romantic ruin to global audiences who had never heard of Les Trois Moutiers or the Vienne department. The video revealed what ground-level photographs could only suggest: the full scope of nature's reclamation. The castle rose from its island like a dream of the medieval past, filtered through a century of abandonment. Images of ivy-clad turrets and moss-grown stones stirred a global interest that would soon transform into something more tangible than admiration. Chapter 6. The Revolution of 50 Euros. In September 2015, 2 young Frenchmen launched a startup in Paris with an idea that seemed almost quixotic: a crowdfunding platform dedicated to saving endangered heritage sites. Romain Delhomme and Bastien Goulard had met at Scama Business School, graduating together in 2011. Both had worked in finance, but they shared passions for travel, charity work, and the preservation of historical places. They named their venture D'Artagnans after the swashbuckling hero of Alexandre Dumas' novel, embodying the famous motto, "One for all, and all for one." The business model was unconventional. D'Artagnans would not simply collect donations for heritage projects. It would facilitate collective ownership of monuments allowing thousands of small contributors to become genuine shareholders in historic properties. The platform charged 8% commission on funds raised, plus an additional 7% for services including strategic development, marketing, restoration assistance, and financial management. The inspiration came from Britain's National Trust, adapted for the crowdfunding age. For 2 years, D'Artagnans helped heritage site owners raise funds for restoration projects across France. The team grew to 14 employees, who called themselves Musketeers. But the founders harbored a larger ambition. Delaume later explained that after 2 years of development at D'Artagnans, and after helping hundreds of heritage landmarks owners, they wanted to have their own historical building to save from A to Z. When the drone footage of LA Mothe-Chandeniers went viral, D'Artagnans recognized the opportunity. Here was the symbol of castles in peril, the most over-mediated among lovers of beautiful romantic ruins, a property that had captured global imagination, but remained in private hands, deteriorating year by year. If collective ownership could save any monument, it would be this one. On April 26, 2016, supporters formed the association Les Amis du Château de la Mothe-Chandeniers, laying the organizational groundwork for what would come. D'Artagnans partnered with Adopter un Château, a heritage preservation association founded by historian Julien Marquis, who would become the operational manager of the castle project. Together, they approached Marc Deamer, the frustrated owner who had once dreamed of restoration before becoming sickened by obstruction. On October 6, 2017, the campaign launched with an initial goal of €500,000, the asking price to purchase the Château from Deamer. The pitch was irresistible. Become a castle lord for just €50. What happened next exceeded anyone's projections. Within approximately 40 days, the campaign reached its initial goal, but contributions kept pouring in from around the world. Media coverage snowballed as the story captured international attention. NPR interviewed Romain Delaume on Weekend Edition. CNN Travel published multiple articles and photo galleries. The Guardian featured the campaign prominently. France 24, Euronews, BBC, Town and Country magazine, Cosmopolitan, and Arab News had all covered the unprecedented effort. François de Rugy, then Speaker of the French Parliament, tweeted his congratulations. He wrote, "Bravo for this initiative, both collective and private. France's historic buildings need a diverse range of ideas to be saved and developed." The campaign's timing proved brilliant. Launching in early October and concluding before Christmas, it allowed contributors to purchase shares as gifts. Many people bought multiple shares for family members, transforming holiday giving into heritage preservation. Romain Delaume noted that the campaign represented something larger than a single castle. The Mothe-Chandeniers is now a sign of what people can do, thanks to internet and social media. When the campaign closed in late December 2017, the results were staggering. 27,190 contributors from 115 countries had invested a combined €1.6 million. The top contributing countries included France, the United States, Germany, China, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. The purchase price of €500,000 was secured many times over, leaving approximately €1.1 million for restoration work. On December 1, 2017, D'Artagnans announced, "It's done. La Mothe-Chandeniers belongs to thousands of internet users." The legal structure that emerged was as innovative as the fundraising itself. The chateau became the property of SAS Château de la Mothe-Chandeniers, a simplified joint stock company. D'Artagnans retained approximately one-third of the shares, giving the organization operational control to pilot restoration. The remaining shares were distributed among the thousands of individual co-owners, each €50 contribution representing one share. Some contributors purchased multiple shares. One investor reportedly bought €10,000 worth, becoming one of the largest individual shareholders. Governance would operate democratically. A board of directors would handle day-to-day decisions, and major choices would go to the annual General Assembly of shareholders. Co-owners could participate and vote through an online platform, with each share representing one vote and majority rule determining outcomes. As de Lejeune explained, "We do what we do exactly in a democracy, and the majority will win." Contributors gained tangible rights in exchange for their investment. Co-owners received free entry to the castle for life. They could vote on major decisions through the digital platform. They were invited to participate in volunteer work camps and restoration projects. They gained access to exclusive events, including private night visits and annual Christmas celebrations. Shares could be kept, called, or passed to children and friends. Critically, contributors had no personal financial liability for castle debts. The obligation to support continued restoration was moral rather than legal. The youngest co-owner was the 10-month-old son of Julien Marquis, who purchased a share as a christening gift. The most prominent supporter was Stéphanie Bern, the French television presenter and heritage advocate, appointed by President Emmanuel Macron as special envoy for endangered heritage. When Bern donated to become a co-owner, he said that when he sees young people from D'Artagnans and adopte un Château mobilizing to save a jewel of heritage and finding an innovative solution, he finds it a wonderful initiative that he wants to encourage. President Emmanuel Macron and Brigitte Macron received shares as a gift from Adopte un Château during a presentation at the Élysée Palace for the launch of France's Heritage Lottery. The First Lady reportedly joked, "Where will my room be?" Romain Delhomme claimed a world record. He said, "We hold the world record for fundraising for a castle." La Mothe-Chandeniers had become the first castle in history purchased through collective crowdfunding. Not by a government, not by a foundation, not by a billionaire, but by ordinary people, united by a shared belief that some things are too beautiful to lose. Chapter 7. Bringing Stone Back to Life. On June 30th, 2018, 86 years after the fire that destroyed it, Château de la Mothe-Chandeniers opened to the public for the first time. Visitors who had contributed €50 to become co-owners crossed the bridge and walked through the grounds they partially owned, experiencing firsthand the romantic ruin they had saved. The initial restoration focused on making the site safe and accessible, rather than rebuilding what had been lost. Lead architect Karsten Hansen worked alongside landscape consultant Arnaud Delacroix to develop a philosophy that would guide all subsequent work. The aim was to preserve the Château while maintaining the magic of its natural surroundings, rather than attempting to restore the castle to its pre-fire condition, an undertaking that would require decades and tens of millions of euros. The approach aimed to create what Hansen called a crystallized romantic ruin, stabilizing structures while preserving the poetic decay that had made Mothe-Chandeniers famous. The decision about the trees proved emblematic of this philosophy. Co-owners voted to conserve the trees growing inside the castle, concluding that they do not threaten the structure and that they give the place much of its charm. The oaks and ash trees that had taken root in the courtyard would remain, their branches threading through windows, their roots binding soil to foundation. The chateau would not be restored to what it was, but preserved as what it had become, a hybrid of architecture and forest, human ambition, and natural reclamation. The first phase of emergency safeguarding, completed from 2017 to 2021, required an investment of approximately €1.1 million in equity. Workers stabilized the clock tower, restored the entrance porch, and secured the turret of the main staircase. An 18-meter brace was installed to shore up vulnerable sections. Masonry repairs addressed the most critical structural weaknesses. Zinc work on metal elements prevented further water infiltration. Beyond the main ruins, the historic orangery was restored to functional condition. A subsequent crowdfunding campaign in 2018 raised additional funds to purchase the chapel, park, and outbuildings that had been separated from the Château during the Credit Lyonnais fragmentation, reuniting approximately 5 acres with the main property. The second phase of development, spanning 2021 to 2023, focused on creating a sustainable tourism operation. A new glass and steel orangery of 400 square meters was constructed, the largest event space in northern Vienna, suitable for weddings, seminars, and private celebrations. 4 eco-lodges were installed in the park, offering overnight accommodation with views of the illuminated ruins. The 2-hectare parkland received scenographic treatment, with paths, lighting, and interpretation, creating a curated visitor experience. By 2023, the Château had welcomed over 80,000 visitors. The Michelin Green Guide awarded the site a star for 3 consecutive years, from 2022 through 2024. The 1,000 Places You Must See in France guide designated it a coup de cœur. Over 150 television reports had been dedicated to the project, generating an estimated 100 million views worldwide. The financial model that emerged defied traditional heritage economics. Rather than depending on government grants or wealthy patrons, the Château generated revenue through multiple streams. Visitor admissions were set at €7.50 for adults. Guided tours cost €11.50. Eco-lodge rentals were approximately €193 per night. Private events took place in the orangery. Wine tastings featured local products, and merchandise was sold in the on-site boutique. The 334 families who stayed in the eco-lodges during the second year of operation demonstrated demand for immersive heritage experiences. By 2025, the SAS de la Mothe-Chandeniers had achieved something remarkable for a heritage restoration project: profitability. The first half of 2025 generated over €220,000 in turnover, exceeding 70% of the full 2024 annual total. Visitor numbers increased by over 150% compared to the previous year. The company announced it would no longer need to open capital to new shareholders after the current fundraising campaign closed, and all future restoration would be funded through tourism revenue and profits. The governance model continued to operate as designed. When architect Hansen presented restoration options, co-owners voted through the online platform to select priorities. The current campaign, titled La Mothe-Chandeniers Last Dance, offers final shares at €102.55 each, with proceeds directed toward whichever restoration priority the co-owners collectively choose: the clock tower, the main courtyard, the grand staircase, or the chapel. The campaign closes on December 31st, 2025, after which no new shareholders will be accepted. The ownership base has grown beyond the original campaign. As of late 2025, 37,111 co-chatelains from 183 countries hold shares in the company. Total investment since 2017 has reached €5.3 million, with approximately €4.7 million net collected through crowdfunding campaigns. D'Artagnan's itself has faced financial difficulties, with subsidiary liquidations reported in 2024, but the Château's operating company continues independently, its profitability insulating it from the parent organization's challenges. Chapter 8. The Cost of Dreams. Stand on the bridge at Mothe-Chandeniers today, and you look across water at a vision that exists nowhere else on Earth. Gothic turrets draped in ivy, tree branches reaching through empty windows, moss-covered stones reflecting in the moat. The fairy tale castle has become something more complex than fairy tales typically allow. A monument to destruction and preservation, abandonment and rescue, the terrible cost of dreams and the stubborn human refusal to let beautiful things die. The families who built and rebuilt this place across 8 centuries, each paid the price of their ambitions. The Basques constructed a fortress to defend territory they would eventually lose. Hugues le Grand rode to crusade and founded a monastery, but his descendants married away their inheritance. The Rochechouars transformed a military stronghold into a Renaissance palace, then watched Francois II bankrupt himself, creating a court in exile. The Hennicars and Ardois invested 14 years reconstructing a ruin into a neo-Gothic fantasy that served primarily as a hunting lodge. The Lejeunes achieved social brilliance during the Second Amour, then lost everything to a heating system malfunction. Each generation believed they were building for eternity. Each discovered that eternity has its own opinions. The 1932 fire destroyed more than a building. It destroyed a library that could never be reassembled, tapestries that could never be reused, paintings and artifacts that represented centuries of accumulation. Baron Robert Lejeune walked away because the true cost of restoration was not measured in francs. It was measured in the impossibility of recovering what fire had consumed. You could rebuild walls. You could not rebuild history. Yet history has a way of rewriting itself. The 85 years of abandonment that should have erased La Mothe-Chandeniers instead transformed it into something unprecedented. The trees that grew through the castle did not destroy it. They created a new form of beauty that no architect could have designed. The ivy that consumed the turrets gave them the appearance of emerging from the forest itself. The moss that carpeted the stones softened edges that had been too precisely cut. Nature did not ruin the ruin. Nature completed it. When 28,000 people from 115 countries contributed 50 euros each to purchase a castle they would never live in, they were not buying real estate. They were buying participation in an idea. The idea that collective action could save what individual effort could not. That small contributions could aggregate into transformative power. That the internet age might offer new solutions to ancient problems of preservation and decay. The Château never received official classification as a French historic monument, which meant no government was obligated to protect it. This absence of official status, which for decades condemned the property to neglect, ultimately enabled the crowdfunding experiment. Unencumbered by heritage regulations, the new owners could pursue their crystallized romantic ruin philosophy without bureaucratic interference. They could preserve trees that conventional restoration would have removed. They could prioritize visitor experience over archaeological accuracy. They could create eco-lodges and glass orangeries that heritage authorities might otherwise have forbidden. The cost of this freedom was the cost of doing everything themselves. No government grants underwrote the restoration. No tax incentives encouraged donations until the IRPME scheme offered 18% relief on investments. Every euro came from individuals who believed the castle was worth saving, and every euro went toward saving it. The total investment of 5.3 million euros represents not institutional largesses, but aggregated personal conviction. 37,000 acts of faith at 50 euros or more apiece. What emerges from the moat today is neither the medieval fortress of the Basques, nor the Renaissance palace of the Rochechouars, nor the neo-Gothic fantasy of Baron Lejeune. It is something new, a monument to the persistence of beauty and the power of collective will. The grand staircase remains inaccessible, but plans exist for floating footbridges that will allow visitors to experience the castle from ground to sky. The clock tower awaits full restoration, its mechanism silent since the fire. The chapel's stained glass windows, miraculously preserved, still filter light through scenes of medieval devotion. The future envisioned by the current owners includes 9 junior suites in the outbuildings, scheduled from 2026 to 2030, projected to break even by their 3rd year of operation. It includes 100,000 annual visitors, transforming the Château into one of France's premier heritage destinations. It includes financial self-sufficiency, with all future restoration funded through tourism revenue rather than additional fundraising. But the most significant transformation may be philosophical rather than architectural. Mothe-Chandeniers has become proof of concept for a new model of heritage preservation, one that does not depend on government mandate or aristocratic fortune, but on the distributed conviction of thousands of ordinary people who believe that some things matter too much to Mothe. Other castles have followed the same path. Château de l'Épinay, with its 7,500 co-owners, Château de Vibrac, and others rescued through the same mechanisms pioneered at Mothe-Chandeniers. The 800 years of history contained in these stones have always been a story of ambition and loss, construction and destruction, the building of dreams and their collapse into ruin. The Boccace dreamed of impregnable defense. The Rochechouart dreamed of courtly magnificence. The Lejeunes dreamed of fairy tale romance. Each dream ended in fire or bankruptcy or simple abandonment, the exhaustion of families who could no longer sustain what their ancestors had begun. The dream that animates Mothe-Chandeniers today is different in kind from all that came before. It is not the dream of a single family seeking to establish dynasty or display wealth. It is the dream of 37,000 strangers, united by a photograph, a drone video, a story of beauty and dissolution. They will never live in the castle they owned. Most will visit only once, if ever. Yet their collective conviction has accomplished what no baron or marquis could achieve alone: the rescue of a monument from oblivion, the transformation of abandonment into renaissance, the proof that in the age of the internet, the cost of dreams can be distributed widely enough that anyone can afford a share. The sun sets over the moat and lights come on in the ruined towers, not the phantom lights of haunting, but the warm glow of restoration in progress. The trees in the courtyard stand silhouetted against the sky, their branches threaded through windows that once held glass. The ivy on the turrets catches the last light, green against gray steel. Somewhere, a visitor crosses the bridge to experience what they helped to save. This is the story of Château de la Mothe-Chandeniers, the castle that refused to die, sustained not by the fortune of one family, but by the faith of thousands, rising from its moat like a dream that the dreamers have finally agreed to share.